Hi, I'm Karishma Chugani, and I'm very happy to have you on this live with me, where I'll be showing you how to make a tree of life using the paper cut technique. Before we begin, I would like to tell you a little bit about myself. I was trained as a fashion designer, but have always been interested in the arts of every format. I trained myself as a visual artist first by painting with oils and then watercolors, and through the years began my fascination as a storyteller. I started writing stories before deciding that I wanted to train as an illustrator. When I moved to Madrid in 2008, I began studying everything related to edition, publishing, and book arts. I started publishing illustrated books, some written by me and some with other texts, in about 2012. And I began paper cutting when I made my first theater book, a very personal story where I was talking about the exile of my family's past. We were born and brought up, well, they were born and brought up in Pakistan, in Sindh. And during the partition between India and Pakistan, they had to be exiled throughout the world. It was a story that I was longing to tell for many, many years, and it was only when I picked up my pair of scissors that I was able to tell it in a way that made me feel comfortable and happy. And ever since that moment, I began my big love story for paper cutting. Through the last years, when I first started paper cutting, I was a bit shy with the technique. I was very scared to use a scalpel, and so I was just using my pair of scissors, a very banal pair of scissors. And but I felt that unveiling the paper, there were so many things inside that I could discover and use surprises and layering, and this made me very excited. So slowly, through practice, I began being more comfortable with the technique and learning how to use the scalpel and elaborating the cuts more as I went along. In this live, I will be showing you how to make a tree of life. So my paper cutting art and developed a lot during the confinement. I started, and the pandemic, I started making huge paper cuts of wild women, and all kinds of details and magical characters were coming out. I also, through my work as a visual artist, have been fascinated with trees as a sacred symbol of life. And for this new year, I wanted to make a tree of life. Now, a tree of life is a very sacred symbol through mythologies across the world. And it's a wonderful thing because in every different culture, philosophy, country, there's so many different symbolisms to what you can wish for through a tree. In the video you're seeing right now, it was me drawing a family tree for an exhibition linked to one of my most important books about my family history. And now I'm going to show you my sketch for a tree of life. So to make a tree of life, well, in my case, what I first did was I wanted to think about all of the wishes that I had for myself and my family in this new year. It was off to a snowy start, so I thought we could use a little bit of warmth and happiness and love. So it is not necessary to make a sketch beforehand. I provided this one just so I can show you all the details. So I always start a tree of life with the roots. I think it's really important to feel anchored to one's roots. And I wanted to use a lot of mythical characters to represent myself and my family. So this is me as a bird girl. And then because I was born and brought up in Morocco and have a link to a lot of Arab and Muslim symbology, this is the hand of Fatima, also known as the Khamisa, which signifies 5 and is a protection. So I have that with all kinds of geometrical symbols. And then there's birds and characters to represent my sun ray. The pomegranate is a recurring symbol in my work because it is a symbol for love and fertility. This little demon cat figure is representative of all of my fears, and I think it's really important to keep your fears close by so that you know how to take care of them. This is the man, my husband Juan. He's always by my side. And then I integrated inside the tree a peacock. So it's really important when paper cutting such a large piece that everything is connected. So although there are separations, you have to keep little connections, otherwise your tree will just fall apart. So when doing this at home, I suggest that you use a solid piece of paper. I'm going to use, this is just my sketch, but I'm going to use a Japanese washi roll because my tree is quite long, as you can see, it's 90 centimeters. There's a little tip here that's really important. I sketched on the back side of the paper so that because Asian papers are very thin and delicate, they're also very strong at the same time. They do not react very well to erasing. So I sketch on the back so that when I turn it around, when I'm finished, everything is clean in case I can't get some of the pencil marks out. So I'm going to start cutting soon. What I suggest, if you have a good piece of paper, you can sketch directly on the paper or sketch previously on tracing paper and trace it over. To make your paper tree of life, you will need a cutting board. So I have this A4 one I'm just going to slip underneath. And I'm going to start scalpel. I will try to use a linear technique, so I will try to work my way up, but I might skip back and forth from time to time because there are different cuts. And it's very important to keep your hand happy and healthy, which means if there's lots of details, you might want to skip over to a place where there's bigger cuts so you don't get tired. So I was surprised to do this sketch on such a long format, but I really wanted to feel like my tree was growing upward towards the sky, which is why I chose this paper. I also really like the washi paper. It cuts beautifully. And as I said before, it's really thin, so it's easy to cut out all kinds of shapes. You don't have to force your scalpel. So there's a few tricks here. Just make sure that you're holding the paper well with your fingers so that you don't lose grip and the paper doesn't fold or wrinkle. And take very extra care, especially if you're not used to doing this, not to cut yourself, please. That would be very tragic. All right. Okay. Now that the roots are done, I'm just going to cut this big piece of paper off so that we see what that looks like. When doing this at home, make sure to have a waste paper basket handy so you can throw away your little bits of paper. Also, as you may have noticed, I've cut a lot of details beforehand, so it's interesting to cut the more intricate details before cutting out the outlines of your shape. That way the paper holds together more solidly. And like I said, try to cut away the pieces so that you can unveil your shape and see what it looks like as you go along. You might not be able to see these lines on the screen, but these are just little decorative details. And when making your tree, you can be as simple or as elaborate and decorative as you wish. The most important thing to remember is that it holds together and that all of your shapes and elements and characters have something to stick onto. Also, another thing that's really important to keep in mind is that while paper cutting, even if, at least in my case, I have everything sketched out, when I start cutting, I let my hands and my scalpel and my scissors redefine the lines wherever I feel like. So it's a very intuitive process linked to play. So I use the pencil lines just as a guideline, but then allow myself to do whatever I want. And there's something that I wanted to mention as well technically. For example, in a drawing, this line that I'm cutting out now would be a single line, but as a paper cut, I've decided to cut it as two separate lines, because if I do the whole line, when I hold up the tree, it won't be as solid. And even if this paper is quite sturdy, I want to make sure it doesn't fall apart. If you're not so comfortable doing little details with your scalpel, one option is to cut a big blob around them and then get back into them at the end with a pair of scissors. So, in order to start as a paper cutter, I think the most important materials to have are a good pair of scissors And that means one that you're comfortable with. So a funny story, when I started paper cutting, I used the most terrible pair of stationary scissors that you could buy at any corner shop. And they were my fetish scissors for about 7 years, and I didn't let anyone have them. And they were just horrible scissors, but they were the ones that made me feel comfortable with. Now I have prettier and more professional pairs, but I still love those original ones too. So a good pair of scissors, a cutting board. I have 2 or 3 cutting boards, so I always have a little A4 one that I use for smaller pieces, and also it's very comfortable to move around with in case you're traveling. Or and then a good scalpel. So I usually used a basic generic scalpel, but last year, I found this fantastic one that has interchangeable blades. So just look around and see if there's anything that you feel more comfortable with. But the advantage to having interchangeable blades is that I usually use this blade because it's the most versatile one, but there's other blades that are good for curves and for smaller details. So, and then a good drawing pencil and an eraser. So today I just brought a standard eraser, but if you have a putty eraser is what charcoal artists use. So it looks like blue tack or Play-Doh. That could be gentler on delicate papers. And then good paper. So I usually recommend, I love working with Asian natural fiber papers. You can find some in most paper specialized shops. And the good thing about them is that they're very resistant to wear and tear, and they're thin enough to be able to do all kinds of fancy cuts in. So that's what I recommend as a basic toolbox for starting out as a paper cutter. Sorry. Okay. So at the moment, I have 2 or 3 pairs of scissors in my toolbox. One of them is this tiny pair, which is very easy to get into small spaces and cut out fine details with. It has really sharp edges, so it's great for making precise cuts. Then I have a big pair of metal scissors, which is very good for cutting larger surfaces. It's just over here. Oh, there. And my latest addition is this cutesy little tiny one that I haven't played around with very much yet because I got it as a Christmas gift. But it's good to have a variety so that you can learn what each pair of scissors can offer you. Sorry. I actually have never really changed blades because I keep changing scalpels. The scalpel I have doesn't have replaceable blades, so you just have to go out and buy a new scalpel, unfortunately. I don't know if there's any other way to answer that question, but I suppose if you're using the same scalpel, you would have to change it every 2 or 3 months. It depends how much paper cutting you're doing, really. No, not too close. So If you're doing a big tree of life and you need a large surface paper, I would recommend just a regular craft paper, or, I mean, there's all kinds of natural fiber papers and even synthetic papers that look like natural fibers that are quite affordable, that can be bought in rolls. There's some rice paper rolls that are quite affordable. I bought one of my first rolls of rice paper was huge. I think it was about 6 or 7 meters, and it was just 10 euros or something. If you make a trip to a good paper shop, just try to buy a few samples and play around with it and see what you're comfortable with. Okay, there's a little tip when you're moving away large pieces of paper. Just gently ease it away like that. Okay, that's a really good question. So, like I said, I'm moving from bottom to top because I think it's really important that the tree has good roots, and it's also visually, for me, makes more sense. But listen to your intuition when cutting. And like I said before, if you feel like a rest from lots of tiny details, you can just move on to a more simple cut, like I'm doing now. Okay. Yeah, if you're breaking the point of your blades, you're putting too much pressure on the top of it. That's for sure. So it's really important that you hold your scalpel as if it was a pen or a pencil, and have a tight grip right here, or at least that's what I do. And then you're trying to put pressure on the entire blade with this part of your hand. So if you're tipping it too much towards the point, then your blade will break. So that's probably what's happening. Try putting more pressure on the back part of your hand and on the table, so that when you're just dragging your knife, you're just cutting away. That might work. Okay, so here I prepared something before that I wanted to show you that is quite interesting. So I cut these little details of the leaf out before, so that when I now go in and cut the outline of the leaf, they're already there. And this is nice because if I'm going to do it the other way around, then my leaf is going to move, and this way it just stays nicely over there. Okay, I'm just going to check that everything is cut here for now. All right, a few more details here. Oh, also, I'm not sure I mentioned something really important. I drew this sketch on the back side of the paper so that on the front side it will be nice and clean when I turn it around. And this is really important. I never used to do this when I started paper cutting, and I spent hours erasing and fighting with pencil lines. So if you're starting out, make a good habit from the beginning. So that will save you a lot of work. Okay. My little cat demon of fears has a dagger, so I'm just going to cut that out. Also, one of the really wonderful things about Asian papers, or any paper really, is that if it bends over and folds, you can iron it out, literally, with an iron. Just put a piece of fabric over it, or a paperweight as well could help. Is there a lot of intuition and try and error? Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most important things for me as a paper cutter is learning how to play. I've learned so many things from mistakes. And also this concept of just drawing with scissors and a scalpel and allowing your hands to do the talking a little bit, and see where they take you. So in this exercise, it's a bit more controlled because I made a sketch beforehand, but in a lot of my paper cuts, I don't sketch beforehand, especially in my life-size ones. So what I suggest, especially if you're starting out, is just to play. And when you play, try to be quite gentle and understanding with yourself, because if you're enjoying yourself, you'll get most likely some very happy surprises. Okay, let's put that there. Okay, I'm left-handed, so sometimes I have this mania for turning things sideways, especially while making big long cuts like this. One of my favorite paper cutters is Matisse, and he has this great tutorial where well, it's not a tutorial, but there's a video of him in his studio. I think he's already on a wheelchair, and he's just has these huge pieces of paper and a pair of scissors, and he's just moving the paper around, and it's also organic and intuitive. And I try to remember that when I get stressed about my paper cuts, and just turn it around and play with it. Okay. So this is a really important part. So there's a pomegranate here that I'm keeping stuck to the tree because I don't want it to fall off. Just, I keep mentioning that, but it's really important, especially if you're not used to paper cutting, because if you cut things out too much, they will fall off. And if they don't fall off immediately, they might fall off over time. Also, back to the question about how to know what to cut first. It's also very important to follow what you feel like cutting. So if you don't feel like doing a lot of tiny details, or if you're tired, make some larger cuts and then come back, which is what I'm going to do in a minute. I'm going to leave the seeds of the pomegranate for the end if I have time. And I'm just going to keep doing the outline of the tree. So as I said before, I'm using a washi roll. Washi paper is from Japan, and it's a fantastic natural fiber paper. I think it's mainly used for calligraphy, but I loved that it came in this very elegant box, and it's a very long roll of paper, so it allows me to do lots of different paper cuts. It's a single roll, but there's attachments every 90 centimeters. So the tree I'm doing today is 90 centimeters because it's an entire sheet of the roll, as you will see when we get to the end. So I usually roll up my paper cuts with some tissue paper or some bubble wrap. I also have, because I was trained as a fashion designer, I actually hang up some of my paper cuts on hangers with clothes covers so that I can protect them. I don't frame, well, I haven't framed the bigger ones yet, so a lot of my paper cuts are hanging as if they were clothes in my studio. But rolling them up is a good idea, or if they're not too big, you can put them in some plastic sleeves in a portfolio. And if they do roller bend, like I said, most papers react really well to an iron, or if you just put them underneath a whole bunch of books or a paperweight, they'll come back to their original form. Okay. Move that. Yeah, okay. So if you make any mistakes, don't worry. There are really easy ways to tape using double-sided tape on the back. You take a tiny piece of the paper. So I always collect scraps. So even if you're using a paper basket to throw away your paper, if you need some at the end, you can just take a little piece and go to the back. In this case, well, the side I'm cutting is the back. And take a tiny piece of paper. I'm just going to show you. Imagine that this was cut. I would take a tiny piece of paper and just glue that on with some strong stick glue or some double-sided tape. And no one will really know the difference. So I'm going to turn this around now. So that I can finish this side. And it's, in my experience, always better to cut towards you than away from you. Although I do make exceptions, but best not to. I think the hardest, yeah, I was just going to talk about that thing to cut when I was starting out was curves. How do you cut precise curved lines? Practice. That's the only way. I couldn't when I started out. So I used scissors a lot because it was really hard for me to cut curved lines with a scalpel. But the more you start thinking about your scalpel as a pencil and a drawing tool, and the more practice you get with the pressure and with the blade, then the easier it will be to curve properly. I like to find inspiration from lots of different sources, to be honest. I'm inspired by all kinds of different visual languages. This is mainly because I think I was born in Morocco, but my family is originally from a part of India that's now in Pakistan. So there are just so many, and my mom was born in Ghana in West Africa. So there's just so many different influences when I was growing up, but also then as a young adult, I moved to England to study in London. And I just love going to museums and galleries, and I find inspiration in movies and songs. I think it's really interesting to mix different influences and have a wide range of inspiration. I'm especially moved by mythologies and medieval art. A lot of miniature painting finds its way into my work as well. Okay. So I'm gonna do something now. I'm just gonna That's a really good question. I'm just going to cut this off now because my tree is almost liberated from the paper so that I don't have this roll bothering me. And I like the question because I think for me the most important thing is to make it true to yourself and tell the story that you wish to tell. So I think it's more important to tell something that's true to yourself than to worry about the aesthetics. But you can play with both. See, I'm doing exactly what I said I shouldn't do. Always try to cut to yourself, not away. When I was doing the sketch for this tree of life, I was very surprised at first that there was no peacock in it. And as I continued moving upward, because I drew it bottom to top as I'm cutting it, I all of a sudden finished the tree shape with these lovely leafy shapes here, and then realized that it could be a peacock. And this refers really well to what I was saying before, that if you just let your intuition take over, then sometimes things fall into place without having to force them. Oops. Also, a very important thing in paper cutting is to rest your hands. So when you're tired, just take a little break move around your fingers. All right. Okay. That's a really good question too. I was thinking about doing a symmetrical tree at first. It's easier to do a symmetrical paper cut in some senses because if you fold the paper in half, then you can cut half at the same time. So you just fold it and cut the half and then you open it out. So you're making half as many cuts. I decided against using a symmetrical shape because I wanted to integrate so many different characters and I just really wanted my shape to be more fluid, but it depends on what you're trying to transmit. When I was thinking about my tree, I was thinking about what I wanted to wish for this coming year and what was important to me. So there was a lot of care and nurturing and abundance and love and light and happiness. And I think it might be a good exercise to start thinking about those questions while you're designing your tree or drawing it, and then worry about the details later. Okay. So when liberating the pieces, just gently hold down the shape. And then if things are being stubborn, like here, just go back into it and make a cut. There we go. Right. I didn't see the question. Okay. I use a strong glue that's a stick glue because I find it easier when working with paper, especially these thin natural fiber papers, to work with a stick glue. A liquid glue might be a bit too messy and might wet and destroy the paper. So the one I use is called, I think, Extra Strong. But there's a variety of strong stick glues that can be used. Also, double-sided tape is great to have to fix wear and tears. That's being stubborn. Okay, there we go. Okay, I'm gonna turn this around again. I think I have just enough time to cut out my peacock. I take a lot of extra time and care when cutting out eyes and characters. It's really important not to go fast. So this peacock is interesting because it's actually a negative shape inside the tree bark, as opposed to the other characters, which are positive shapes. You can see I left a little space for the eye. And always remember what I said about the connections. If you don't leave paper connecting the shapes, then you'll just have big holes in your drawing, which is not what we want. So I got into paper cutting by mistake. I always felt much more comfortable with a pair of scissors than with a pencil when I first started to illustrate. So I was doing a lot of collage. And then I realized that cutting silhouettes made me very happy. And especially that when I'm using scissors or a scalpel, I connect to a part of creativity inside of me that is much more relaxed and playful. Okay. And I must say that it's quite an addictive technique for me. So once I started paper cutting, I just wanted to do it more and more. And it's a wonderful cycle, really, because the more you cut, the better your skills get, and then the easier you can make more elaborate cuts, so it becomes a little bit addictive. And I find that it's a wonderful way of telling stories. There's also so much visual inspiration throughout the world of paper cutting techniques in Japan and in China, and shadow puppetry from Turkey and Poland. And I also especially love it because you can make a paper cut relatively fast. Well, depending on how elaborate you want to be. So now I'm just going to go back and finish off some of the last details. The smiles and the noses. Here's another one. You can see that. Mm-hmm. Those leaves. When I decided to do a tree of life, I liked the idea of having a kind of a talisman that I could hang up in my studio for the entire year and remind me of all the good things that I wish for, with the hope that just by looking at them and wishing them, they would come true. So I think I'll be hanging this one up in my studio very soon. Finally, I didn't use a pair of scissors almost at all on this project, which is very strange for me, but I guess it's because everything is so intricate. It was just easier to use the scalpel. Just going to turn this around here. A minute. Where was I? All right, I'm almost done. So if anyone has some last questions, now's the time. Oh, I use all kinds of paper. Sometimes I use printed paper. Sometimes I use different colored papers. I started using light colored papers this year because I just found the texture of the papers that I really liked came in natural colors or in white. But no, I use all kinds of colors. I actually use a lot of black when doing silhouettes. For shadow puppetry, these work best with darker color papers. Okay, now this is finished. All right, but when using, I guess it's really hard for me to just choose one project that is my favorite, but one of the most important pieces for me was my work, my first theater book, Tonight and Back, I suppose. So while I'm answering that question, I'm going to put a colored piece of paper in the background so that you can see my tree, and I've turned it around so that you don't see the pencil marks anymore. So coming back to my favorite project, I guess it's my first theater book, Tonight and Back. because that's when I felt that I was really starting to find my own visual language. And it's a hand-cut theater book about my ancestors' exile from India, and it's a very special book for me. And this is my tree of life. So I'm just going to move that slowly. Without getting it caught, so that you can see all the details. There's a very stubborn leaf there. Okay, here we go. I find concentration a lot. I listen to music a lot when I work, so I also meditate before doing some paper cuts sometimes, but music helps me connect a lot, and that helps me concentrate when I'm paper cutting. So now that you've seen this lying down, I'm just going to hold it up for you. This is my tree of life for 2021. I hope you enjoyed seeing me make it. I hope you enjoyed making your own, and if you have, I would love to see the results. You can join me on my course and on the forum in Domestika, where I have a course about paper cutting techniques for storytelling. It was a pleasure to spend this hour with you and to share my wishes for 2021 with you. Thank you.
Esto es lo que yo les voy a enseñar hoy día. I'll be showing you guys how to finish this mask.